The winter of 1942 didn't care what uniform you wore. German, Soviet, officer, recruit, it froze everyone the same way. Inside dugouts colder than a household freezer, soldiers woke up with ice on their blankets, and sometimes on their faces. Hands cracked, boots stiffened, rifles jammed. And then, in the middle of this frozen hell, someone lit a single candle inside a stack of metal cans. The temperature in the shelter began to rise. Not much, but just enough to keep men alive. How did this tiny flame keep entire WW2 shelters warm, with almost nothing? And why was this improvised invention quietly used across the entire Eastern Front? Well, that's the forgotten story you're about to hear. Before we talk about the invention, we need to understand the problem. Because the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. On the Eastern Front, temperatures regularly dropped to 20 degrees, sometimes lower. Inside underground shelters, the cold would settle like an enemy you couldn't shoot at. Breath turned into frost instantly. Water froze inside canteens. Even food hardened into blocks you had to carve with a knife. And worst of all, firewood was almost impossible to find. Trees were miles away. Shells had blasted forests into splinters, and carrying fuel under enemy fire was suicide. So soldiers needed warmth without firewood, heat without fuel, light without smoke. And so, inside these dark, freezing bunkers, a strange little invention appeared. A stack of cans, a candle, and a trick no army ever officially taught, yet thousands of soldiers quietly relied on. Here's how it worked, and why it mattered. At first glance, it didn't look like much. A few empty ration tins stacked one on top of another. Rusty edges, bent walls, the kind of scrap metal soldiers usually kicked aside without thinking. But someone, we don't know who, had an idea. Maybe a Soviet conscript trying to thaw his fingers. Maybe a German machine gunner desperate to dry his socks. What we do know is that almost overnight, these crude towers of cans began appearing in dugouts on both sides of the front. A simple flame at the bottom. Warm air rising through the cylinder. Cold steel slowly becoming warm to the touch. Soldiers didn't write manuals for it. There were no official blueprints. But the design kept spreading. Passed from trench to trench, bunker to bunker, through whispers, gestures, and quick demonstrations. A tiny improvised stove. That worked almost like magic. So, how could a single candle, something barely strong enough to light a table, warm an entire shelter? Actually, the trick relies on three simple principles. 1. The chimney effect. Inside the tower of cans, hot air rises upward. As it moves through the narrow metal tube, it accelerates, just like in a real stove. This creates a gentle airflow that pulls in fresh, cold air from below. More airflow, faster heating. 2. Metal as a heat battery. Tin cans may look thin, but metal absorbs heat very quickly. Once the candle burns for a few minutes, the entire tower warms up. It becomes a radiator, releasing heat evenly in all directions. The soldiers would place their hands near the surface and feel the warmth spreading outward. 3. Concentration of heat. A candle flame in open air loses almost all its heat immediately. But inside this small metal chamber, the heat is trapped, reflected, and intensified. Some soldiers reported their shelters warming by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, depending on size and insulation. And there were bonus uses. You could melt snow for drinking water, dry gloves or socks, warm up canned food without smoke or sparks, create a tiny draft that kept moisture out of the air. It wasn't a campfire. It wasn't cozy. But in a frozen bunker where your breath hung in the air like mist, this little contraption felt like a miracle. Now, the real question is, if it was so simple and so effective, Why did it become so widespread? Why did every army on both sides of the front quietly rely on it? That's where we go next. So, why did this improvised heater spread so fast across the front lines? Simple. Every soldier had the materials. Empty ration cans were everywhere. Pork and beans tins, condensed milk tins, meat rations, coffee tins. The war produced mountains of them every single day. And normally they were just trash. But in a world where everything froze, trash suddenly became survival gear. No tools were needed, no fuel, no training. Just a candle, or even a piece of cloth soaked in grease, and a stack of tins. And unlike a fire or a stove, this little tower didn't fill the bunker with smoke. It didn't reveal your position. It didn't burn through your supplies. It was quiet, clean, and safe to use even in cramped underground shelters. So soldiers kept building them and improving them, adding ventilation holes, punching air slots with bayonets, stacking bigger cans for more heat. It wasn't official equipment, it was field engineering born out of desperation. In diaries from the Eastern Front, German and Soviet, you find the same scenes described again and again. A dugout, a group of young men barely older than boys. And in the center of the dark shelter, a single warm glow. One Soviet infantryman wrote that his squad would take turns warming their hands above a tower of food cans, as he called it. A German machine gunner described melting snow for tea on one of these improvised stoves as artillery shook the earth above him. Another soldier remembered drying his socks over the tiny flame, praying they'd be warm enough for the next morning's march. And the most striking part? No one ever claimed to invent it. There was no official model, no patent, no recognition, just countless soldiers passing the idea along, quietly helping each other survive one more night in the coldest war on Earth. Narrator: this tiny tower of cans wasn't just a heater, it was hope, a reminder that even in war, ingenuity, cooperation, and a single candle could save lives. And it still works today, but that part comes next. What's fascinating is that this forgotten WW2 trick never truly disappeared. In fact, survivalists, campers, and ultralight hikers still build nearly the exact same thing. Today, it has names: hobo stove, emergency heater, tin can stove, but the principle, it's identical to what soldiers improvised 8 decades ago under fire. The same chimney effect, the same heat concentration, the same ability to warm a small space with nearly no fuel. It turns out the soldiers weren't just surviving, they were inventing. And their invention became the foundation for dozens of modern emergency heating designs. Even the popular clay pot candle heaters you see today are based on the same physics: trap heat, focus it, radiate it. So the next time you see someone warming their hands over a tiny flame during a winter power outage, remember, that idea was keeping soldiers alive long before it became a survival hack on YouTube. A tower of cans, a single candle, and a trick that turned freezing shelters into barely livable sanctuaries in the deadliest winters of World War II. It's the kind of story history almost forgets, because it's not about generals or tanks or battles. It's about ordinary men fighting the cold with whatever they had. If you enjoy discovering hidden inventions that shaped the past, the small ideas that kept people alive in impossible situations, make sure to subscribe, because in the next episode we're diving into a wartime ration so strange, soldiers used it for everything except eating it.